of the Soviet Union had been telling both Roosevelt and Churchill that he would be basically entering into the Pacific theater soon. They didn't know when soon was, but when he never got into it, the war with Germany was over. Harry Truman was now president after Roosevelt died in April of 1945, and Harry Truman was trying to find a way to end this particular war, and they had a agreement to meet at Potsdam, which is a suburb of Berlin, to deal with what they thought at that time would be nothing more than dealing with how to deal with the war in Germany and solve all the problems. And it became quite evident that Harry Truman, the more he read about the two previous engagements, that this man was supposed to come into the war. And then when he found out about the atomic weapon and how during the middle of the Potsdam Conference, Harry Truman decided if he was ever going to use it, he would use it before the Soviets came in, because Joe Stalin said he would come in on August the 8th. We dropped the first atomic bomb on August the 6th. The Japanese did surrender. We dropped the second one on Nagasaki on August the 9th. The Russians did come in on August the 8th, and when they came in through Korea.
The Russians entered the war on August 8th. Their advance on the Asian mainland took them into Korea as far as the 38th parallel. U.S. troops also landed in Korea, and as a result, Russian troops occupied the north, while American forces occupied the south.
Minus 5 seconds.
At the end of the war, America, enjoying a brief monopoly on the atom bomb, conducted tests in the Bikini Atoll on July 25, 1946. The world was impressed by the casual destruction of so many warships as much as it was by the bomb itself. The Berlin airlift heightened the Cold War tensions in 1948. In 1949, the Western powers came together to form the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO.
We have to also realize that the United States foreign policy changed dramatically in 1947 with the Truman Doctrine. The Truman Doctrine was the first time we decided we were going to be involved in something in which war had not been declared. And Truman got Congress to approve giving military assistance and money and to Greece and Turkey to save them from falling into the hands of Joe Stalin and the Communist Party. We started seeing what was happening in Eastern Europe. Later, that became the Marshall Plan in 1948. We had the Berlin airlift in 1948-49. We saw that NATO was created in 1949 to stop Western Europe from falling into the hands of the communists. And in 1949, the Russians developed the atomic weapon. And as a result, that was setting a stage for what was to eventually come.
When the Soviets, and soon the French, British, and Chinese acquired the bomb, huge arsenals were quickly built. The ability to annihilate the planet many times over evolved into the concept of mutual assured destruction, MAD, which meant that neither side would start a war if they were guaranteed to be destroyed. This meant that full-scale war was out of the question. The major powers began to look at brushfire wars as a mean to advance their political ambitions. In the Pacific, the seeds for more conflict were being sown all over Asia. As the Soviets moved into the northern part of Korea, U.S. troops landed at Incheon to begin the occupation of the South. With their focus overwhelmingly being on Japan, the American military authorities paid much less attention to Korea, and soldiers generally did not want to be assigned there. General MacArthur had appointed Lieutenant General John R. Hodge to administer Korean affairs. It was an assignment he did not want and was ill-prepared to carry out. On September 9th, the Provisional Government of the Republic of Korea sent a delegation with 3 interpreters to meet with the American general. The purpose was to discuss setting up a unified government and early elections. But Hodge refused to meet with them. While America's former enemy Japan was put under the administration of civilians, liberated Korea was placed under the direct administration of military units.
But here in this particular part of the world, people assumed that in Korea, that ultimately the people would determine themselves which way the country would go, and they would have some form of election. But in reality, by 1948, the North had developed into we called the North Korea today, and for lack of better terms, we'll call the Republic of Korea South Korea.
The U.S. occupation authorities in southern Korea viewed many indigenous attempts at government as a communist insurgency and refused to recognize the provisional government. However, an anti-communist named Syngman Rhee, who moved back to Korea after decades of exile in the U.S., was considered an acceptable candidate to lead the country. Under Rhee, the southern government conducted a number of military campaigns against left-wing insurgents who took up arms against the government. He also crushed any other political opponents. In the north, the Soviet Army established the Soviet Civil Authority to rule the country until a domestic regime, friendly to the USSR, could be established. Provisional committees were set up across the country, putting communists into key positions. In February 1946, a provisional government called the North Korean Provisional People's Committee was formed under Kim Il-sung, who had spent the last years of the war training with Soviet troops in Manchuria.
We had two strong leaders over there, one in the north, which was Kim Il-sung, and one in the south, which is Syngman Rhee, who had been around for a long time. Syngman Rhee was around during World War I. So both of these men were very strong and determined, and one was being supported by basically the Soviet Union, and one is being supported predominantly by the United States at this particular time.
And both had strong beliefs as to what a unified Korea should be.
Both of these people grew up in an area where they were very, very comfortable. Kim Il-sung was a person who, after being indoctrinated, was determined that, well, the two, let's face it, were basically natural rivals. Kim Il-sung was a little younger than Syngman Rhee. He was a man who saw himself as the future leader of a unified Korea. Syngman Rhee saw himself as the man who should be the leader because he had been around the longest. It was a rival, you could almost call it a political rival, but one had developed in the north, basically, in which he had become under the influence of the Soviet Union, and the other one was going to be basically tied into the United States.
With mistrust growing rapidly between the United States and the Soviet Union, no agreement was reached on how to reconcile the competing provisional governments. The U.S. brought the problem before the newly formed United Nations in the fall of 1947, which the USSR opposed. The UN was created to replace the League of Nations that failed so miserably after the First World War. Roosevelt had first used the term United Nations when 26 nations signed the Declaration of the United Nations on January 1, 1942. From April to October 1945, 51 nations met in San Francisco and created the United Nations. The headquarters were set up in New York after the charter was ratified by a majority of the member nations. The major allies, China, the Soviet Union, France, Great Britain, and the United States, held seats on the Security Council. Each country held veto power over any decision the Security Council made. The UN passed a resolution on November 14, 1947, declaring that free elections should be held in Korea at the earliest possible date. The resolution also stated that foreign troops should be withdrawn and a UN Commission for Korea should be created. The Soviet Union, although a member with veto powers, boycotted the voting and did not consider the resolution to be binding. In April 1948, a conference of organizations from the North and the South met in Pyongyang to plan for a unified general election. This conference produced no results, and the Soviets boycotted the UN-supervised elections in the South. On May 10th, the South held elections. Syngman Rhee, who had called for partial elections in the South to consolidate his power as early as 1947, was elected, though left-wing parties boycotted the election. Widespread corruption was reported in the elections, and the Republic of Korea began life without a great deal of legitimacy. On August 15th, the Republic of Korea formally took over power from the U.S. military. Meanwhile, across the Yalu River in China, another player entered the game for control of the hearts and minds of the Korean people.
Now, China had gone through a major civil war, and that was another big issue because the communists drove the nationalist forces of Chiang Kai-shek to the island of Formosa, which we call Taiwan today, and all of mainland China became Red China in 1949. So the world was set in a stage, and to top everything off in February of 1950, the Soviet Union and Red China signed a 30-year perpetual agreement of friendship between Mao Zedong and Joe Stalin. And we really didn't know what that said. What do you mean by a 30-year friendship? In our eyes, right now, Red China and the Soviet Union are pretty much together. And this was something, these are the two largest communist countries in the world. And that was something that we were setting the political stage for this particular invasion that eventually would come in June.
The Cold War was about to heat up.